The restaurant buzzed with quiet luxury and the scent of expensive wine. Crystal glasses caught the amber glow of the chandeliers. Suddenly, a hostess hesitated beside a small, unassuming table. "This seat is reserved," she said sharply, her eyes on the young girl. The single dad stood up slowly, his movements steady. His daughter clutched his hand. He didn't raise his voice. He only said one calm, shattering sentence that silenced the air. "She's with me." The billionaire heiress froze, and the entire table fell silent. Lucas Reed was 42 years old, a man whose face held the quiet, etched strength of someone who had survived a long, lonely storm. He was a freelance systems engineer, a genius with code who lived in the invisible spaces of technology. Before the world collapsed around him, Lucas had been a rising star in a major tech firm, a man whose future seemed written in the bright lights of success. But when the diagnosis came for Elena, he didn't hesitate. He traded the high-rise office for a home desk and the corporate ladder for the bedside chair of the woman he loved. He was a man who lived between contracts and between dreams that had long since been put on hold to build a bridge for someone else. His status in society was invisible. He was a single father to a 9-year-old daughter named Mia, who was the sun, moon, and stars of his quiet universe. Lucas lived modestly, almost invisibly, in a world that demanded attention. Their home was an old apartment on the edge of the city where the floors creaked in the night like old comforting memories. The furniture was secondhand, pieces he had spent countless weekends sanding, repainting, and breathing life back into. He preferred the quiet evening spent under the warm, flickering glow of a thrifted lamp, teaching Mia the logic of math and the magic of stories. Every scratch on their dining table told a story of a craft project or a late-night study session. His world had shifted on its axis 4 years earlier. His wife, Elena, had passed away in the middle of a Tuesday, a sudden illness that the doctors couldn't name fast enough to save her. There was no time to prepare for the crushing silence, no time to say a proper goodbye or plan for a life without her contagious laughter. Just the cold, echoing reality of a half-empty home and a young girl asking where her mother was with tears in her eyes. Since then, Lucas had structured his entire life around one single, unbreakable pillar: stability for Mia. He turned down high-paying jobs in Silicon Valley because they would take him away from her bedtime stories and Saturday morning pancakes. He worked late into the night after she fell asleep, his eyes tired but his heart resolved by the sight of her peaceful face. Mia was a bright, intuitive child who felt the world deeply. She was curious about the mechanics of the world and polite to a fault, even when the world didn't deserve her kindness. She had her mother's eyes, large, observant, and full of a wisdom that often made Lucas catch his breath. Tonight, however, Lucas was determined to break the routine of their modest life. He wanted to make a memory that would last her a lifetime, a memory that would tell her she belonged anywhere she chose to stand. He brought Mia to the Gilded Lily. It was a high-end restaurant where the menus didn't have prices, only descriptions of decadence. It was her 9th birthday, and for Mia, this was a fairy tale come to life. He had saved for 6 long months for this single evening. He had skipped his own lunches, bringing crackers to work to save every penny. He had walked 3 miles to every client meeting to save on gas and bus fare, all for this one night, this one seat at this specific table. Lucas wore his only clean jacket, though the cuffs were slightly frayed and the thread was thinning at the elbows. Mia wore a simple cotton dress, ironed so many times the fabric felt like silk against her skin. They looked like a small, brave patch of common ground in a room full of genuine silk, diamonds, and cold gold. They were out of place, and they knew it, but Lucas held her hand as if they owned the foundation of the building. Nearby sat Victoria Langford, 28 years old and the apex of the city's social hierarchy. A billionaire heiress to the Langford shipping empire, she was a woman who saw the world in terms of assets and liabilities. She was known in social circles for her sharp, cutting words and even sharper standards. Victoria noticed Lucas and Mia the moment they stepped into the foyer. Not out of interest or curiosity, not out of a shared sense of humanity, but out of a visceral, learned judgment. To her, their presence was a blemish on the evening's carefully curated aesthetic. She saw the worn jacket and felt an instinctive urge to look away, as if poverty were contagious. She saw the simple dress and felt it was an insult to the Michelin stars of the kitchen. She signaled the hostess with a dismissive flick of her diamond-encrusted wrist. She whispered something cold, something about maintaining the prestige of the establishment. The hostess, eager to please a woman who could buy and sell the restaurant, approached Lucas. She didn't look at his face, for that would require acknowledging his humanity. She pointed directly at Mia's chair, her lip curling slightly. "I'm sorry, but this seat is not available for guests who do not meet the minimum dress code," she said firmly. Mia lowered her head, her birthday joy evaporating instantly like mist in the sun. She was used to being invisible in the grocery store or the park. She was used to people deciding she didn't belong before she even opened her mouth to speak. Lucas felt the shift in the air instantly. The warmth of the room turned to ice. He looked down at his daughter's shrinking shoulders and her small trembling hands. And in that moment, a dormant fire woke up inside him. Lucas recognized the same shame he once felt as a child, standing in a line for free lunch. When adults decided who belonged and who didn't, based entirely on the brand of their shoes. The air in the Gilded Lily seemed to thicken with the collective judgment of the room. Lucas took a deep, steadying breath, the kind he used when a server farm was crashing and millions were on the line. He didn't pull Mia away. He didn't let go of her hand. He simply asked for clarification, his voice low and dangerous like a distant thunder. "We have a reservation," he said, his words enunciated with perfect precision. The hostess avoided eye contact, staring instead at her digital tablet. "The reservation was flagged for a discrepancy, sir. We cannot accommodate extra guests who might disturb the ambiance of the other diners." It was a lie, a transparent and ugly lie designed to make them feel small and unworthy. Victoria watched from the next table, her chin resting on her hand. She was smiling faintly, the way one might watch a minor drama unfold on a stage. She was a predator watching a struggle, enjoying the display of her own unspoken influence. The other guests, the men in $5,000 suits and women in couture, pretending not to see. They stared at their gold-leafed appetizers. They focused on the bouquet of their vintage Bordeaux. Mia whispered, her voice a tiny broken thread that tore at Lucas's soul. "Daddy, we can go. I'm not even that hungry anymore. We can get pizza at home." Lucas felt his heart break into 1,000 pieces. Then he felt those pieces fuse back together into something harder than diamond. He knelt beside her on the plush carpet, ignoring the looks of disgust from the surrounding tables. He took her small, cold hands in his and looked directly into her eyes, blocking out the rest of the world. "Mia, look at me. Look at your father," he said. "You belong here. You are the guest of honor tonight. Do you hear me?" He kept his voice steady, a beacon of safety in a storm of elitism. He stood up slowly, and the room seemed to shrink as he drew himself to his full height. "She's with me," he said. The words were not loud, but they had a physical weight that settled over the entire restaurant. The cello player stopped for a heartbeat, the bow hovering over the strings. Victoria stiffened, her smile flickering and dying like a candle in a draft. Something about his tone unsettled her deep in her bones. It wasn't the voice of a man who was begging for a favor or a break. It was the voice of a king who already knew his worth and was simply stating an unchangeable fact. She snapped, her voice high and brittle. "This is a private reservation area, sir. Some of us pay a premium for a certain atmosphere, not for a playground or a charity case." Lucas met her eyes for the first time, and Victoria felt a strange, sharp jolt of fear. He didn't see the billions in her bank account. He saw a woman who was hiding behind a wall of gold because she was terrified of the dark and the quiet. He explained simply, without a hint of tremor or hesitation. The reservation was under his name, confirmed weeks ago. He had prepaid the deposit 6 months ago, a sum that represented hundreds of hours of labor and sacrifice. He had confirmed the seating for two, explicitly mentioning it was a child's birthday. The hostess, pressured by the absolute silence that had fallen over the room, checked the system one more time. Her fingers trembled as she swiped the screen, the blue light reflecting in her panicked eyes. Her face drained of color as the truth appeared in glowing pixels. I see." Mr. Reed, the system shows you are indeed a platinum tier guest, she stammered. Victoria froze. The clerical error was born of her own prejudice, not a mistake in the establishment's ledger. Suddenly, memories she had buried for 20 years rushed back into her mind with the force of a tidal wave. She remembered being 6 years old, sitting at the far end of a 30-foot mahogany table. She remembered the nannies who raised her while her father was in London, Tokyo, or Paris. She remembered being present but unseen at 100 gala events where she was treated like a silent prop. She realized with a sickening thud in her stomach that she was currently playing the role of the very people she used to cry about. Lucas didn't gloat or demand a public apology. He didn't make a scene to humiliate the hostess further, though he had every right to. He didn't even look back at Victoria to see her reaction or seek her approval. He simply pulled out Mia's chair with a gentle, courtly grace that made the men in the room look like amateurs. He helped her sit down, his movements full of a love that money couldn't buy and status couldn't replicate. He tucked her silk napkin into her collar as if she were a queen receiving her subjects. And then he began to talk to her about the history of the stars and the logic of the universe, cutting her bread quietly. He restored her sense of safety and belonging without using a single word of conflict. The silence in the restaurant changed. It wasn't the silence of judgment anymore. It was the silence of deep, uncomfortable, and sudden respect. Patrons who had been avoiding their gaze now found themselves watching with a strange, aching envy, not for the food, but for the connection. Victoria felt exposed, as if the walls of the restaurant had turned to glass, and the world was watching her fail. For the first time in her life, her power had failed to intimidate a nobody. In her world, money bought everything: silence, compliance, and even a form of fake, hollow respect. But this man, this freelance engineer in a frayed jacket, owned a currency she didn't recognize: dignity. She tried one last time to reclaim her territory, to push back the feeling of shame rising in her throat. She lashed out verbally, her voice echoing too loudly in the quiet, sophisticated room. She accused Lucas of manipulating the staff and staging a moment to ruin the mood for everyone else who actually belongs here. Lucas remained calm, his hands steady as he poured Mia's water, the crystal pitcher catching the light. His focus never left his daughter, who was slowly starting to smile again, her confidence returning. Eventually, he looked back at Victoria, his gaze neutral and piercing, seeing right through her. He didn't argue the points she made. He knew they were just noise. He just spoke of his life, not to brag, but to provide a mirror for her to look into and see her own reflection. He spoke of the high-level tech contracts he had walked away from so he could be home to tuck Mia in and hear about her day. He spoke of the caregiving gaps that people in her circle filled with high-priced nannies, boarding schools, and therapy. While he filled those gaps with his own presence, his own sweat, and his own unwavering heart. Other guests began to stop eating entirely, their forks resting on their plates. The servers stood still, napkins draped over their arms like white flags of surrender. They were all listening now, caught in the gravity of a man who had nothing to lose but his daughter's respect. The restaurant manager finally intervened, having been alerted by the commotion from the kitchen. He was a man who lived and died by the reputation of the Gilded Lily. He didn't side with the billionaire heiress. He saw the prepaid receipt on the terminal, a testament to a father's long-term plan. He saw the quiet, unshakable dignity of the father and the pure joy returning to the child's face. The manager apologized publicly, his voice clear and sincere, heard by every patron. He offered the finest dessert in the house, a golden chocolate sphere that looked like a planet, on the firm. Victoria realized every eye in the room was on her, and for once, they weren't looking at her with envy for her dress or her family name. They were looking at her with pity for her small, cold soul. She tried to pull rank one last time, mentioning the Langford family's history with the restaurant's billionaire owners. Lucas responded quietly, his words final and absolute. "My daughter doesn't need a name to belong here, Ms. Langford. She just needs a father who stays when things get difficult. Can you say the same for your own life? Have you ever had anyone just stay?" The silence that followed was absolute, heavy with the weight of unsaid truths and old wounds. Victoria remembered being the child who sat on the stairs, waiting for a father who never came home for birthdays or holidays. She realized she had been become the very monster she used to cry about in the dark. She stood abruptly, her heart pounding against her ribs like a trapped bird. Her chair scraped harshly against the marble floor, a jarring sound in the temple of luxury. She fled the restaurant, her heels clicking rapidly toward the exit, ignoring the calls of her confused companions. Outside, in the cool, indifferent night air, the billionaire heiress broke down. She didn't lose a fight over a table or a reservation. She realized she had been fighting for a life that was hollow, cold, and utterly alone. Later that night, after the stars had shifted and the city had slowed down, she did something no one in her world would ever expect. She returned. She walked back through those heavy oak doors, past the startled hostess who tried to apologize again. She walked back to table 14, her eyes red but her gaze steady. She didn't offer a check for $1 million or a fancy gift. She didn't offer a business card or a shallow, rehearsed apology. She looked at Mia, who was eating her golden dessert with wide-eyed wonder and a smeared face. Then she looked at Lucas, who was watching her with a cautious, open, and strangely kind expression. "I am sorry," she whispered, her voice breaking for the first time in public since she was a child. "I forgot what it was like to be a daughter, and I forgot what it was like to see a real father. Thank you for reminding me what actually matters." The status was set aside. The billionaire ego was gone, shattered on the floor of the restaurant. Humility had finally taken its place, and for Victoria, it was the first real thing she had felt in years. Over the next few weeks, Victoria's world began to change from the inside out, one small choice at a time. She realized her life was full of numbers, statistics, and shallow praise, but entirely empty of meaning. She reached out to Lucas, but she did it differently this time, without the armor of her wealth. She didn't send a lawyer, an assistant, or a fancy floral arrangement. She didn't offer him a high-paying job or a fancy car to make things right. She reached out with words, short, honest letters of apology that she wrote by hand on plain paper. She began volunteering quietly at a local community center in a neighborhood she used to drive through with her windows rolled up. She didn't bring the cameras, the PR teams, or the social media influencers. She didn't post a single photo on her accounts, letting her digital life go dark while her real life began to glow. She learned to listen to people who had never seen a private jet and didn't care about her last name. She learned that the most powerful people in the world are often the ones who don't need to say a word to be heard. One afternoon, she brought a box of old art supplies she had discovered in her family's attic, paints and brushes that had never been used, relics of a childhood she was now reclaiming. Mia asked her father one day while they were at the park, watching the leaves fall, "Daddy, is that lady from the restaurant lonely? I see her at the art center sometimes, and she looks like she's looking for something." Lucas looked across the grass to where Victoria sat on a worn-out blanket, helping a group of kids with a mural. He saw her messy hair, her paint-stained fingers, and her genuine, unpracticed smile that reached her eyes. "Yes, Mia," he answered honestly, his heart softening more than he thought possible. "I think she was very lonely, but she's finding her way home now. We all have to find our way home sometimes." Victoria learned what presence actually meant. It wasn't just being there, it was being for someone. She learned that life isn't a performance for the elite. It's a series of small, quiet connections made in the light of day. She began to understand that Lucas hadn't just stood up for a chair. He had stood up for the soul of everyone in that room who had forgotten how to be human. Months later, the seasons had changed, and the air held the crisp, invigorating promise of autumn. Lucas and Mia returned to the same restaurant, the Gilded Lily, for a small celebration of a new contract. This time, there was no tension in their steps, no hesitation at the door. There was no fear of being turned away or judged by the cuffs of a jacket or the simplicity of a dress. The hostess smiled warmly as they entered, recognizing them as the family who changed the room and taught them a lesson. Victoria was there too, but she wasn't sitting at a table of gold, isolation, and judgment. She was waiting by the entrance, dressed in a simple sweater and jeans, looking more comfortable than she ever had in silk. When Mia approached, Victoria didn't stay seated behind a wall of status and glass. She stood up, her eyes bright and clear, reflecting a peace she had fought hard to earn. She greeted them not as a benefactor or a billionaire, but as a friend who had been through the fire and come out whole. The final scene shows Lucas and Mia walking home as the sun sets over the city, painting the sky in shades of violet and gold. The streetlights cast long, dancing shadows on the pavement, and the air is filled with the sound of their shared laughter. They are holding hands, a small, unbreakable unit against the vastness of the world. Lucas looks down at his daughter and sees her mother's smile, but also a new, fierce confidence in her stride. The final message of their journey is clear to anyone who cares to listen with their heart. Belonging is not a gift granted by the wealthy, the powerful, or the elite establishments. It is not something you can buy with a legacy, a name, or a bank account. It is a right claimed by love and defended by truth. It is held calmly, with the quiet, unyielding strength of a father's heart. And it never ever needs an apology from those who truly understand what it means to be home. If you believe healing stories like this deserve to be told, if you believe that a father's love is the greatest wealth there is in this world, leave a comment below and subscribe to CPH Healing Stories. We tell the stories that the world often tries to forget in its rush for more. Stories that remind us that love is the only thing that makes us truly, eternally rich. Thank you for being part of our journey.